G'day listeners and welcome to the broadcast. Today I'm coming to you from down in the dungeon in Parliament, my office deep in the basement with very little natural light. And I'm here to go through the budget. We're at estimates, so this is when we pull apart the budget. And today I think what we really probably should start talking about is how do we start fixing the budget. Now, if you've been watching my social media, you'd see that I've been absolutely having a crack at the government about the state of the budget. And today I'd probably start to talk about maybe some ideas on how to start turning things around. So first of all, why do we need to fix the budget? I think it's quite simple. Basically, if you look at this document, here it is again, how many pages? The state is spending about $1.5 billion more than the state's income, and this simply cannot go on. Just to put that in context, $1.5 billion is 1,500 million, or it is 1.5 with 8 zeros. This is a lot of money. And soon Tasmania will actually be spending over $1 billion every year just servicing state debt. So this can't go on. So what we've seen over the past 4 or 5 years is the state has been, the Liberals pretty much have been spending well over $1 billion more than their income, and now what we're doing is actually borrowing money to service that debt. The budget's not turning around. It's just getting worse and worse every year, and we're into that cycle, a bit like somebody buying their groceries on the credit card. It only ends up in a lot of trouble. Now, I know, when I start talking about the budget, I'll get lots of comments about the stadium, and yes, of course, the stadium is an issue, but let's just say that we axe the stadium, it won't actually make a jot of difference. So just to put it in context, the stadium is going to cost about $300 million a year for about 3 years. So that wouldn't even touch the sides. So just to put this in context, the debt and the debt servicing repayments are so bad that in a couple of years' time, we would have enough money to build a stadium every year just on the money we spend servicing the debt. And that is the scale of the problem. So while, building a stadium will cost money, it pales into insignificance when you think about the state of the budget, really. So if we're spending $1 billion a year just on interest and servicing debt, that's $1 billion you can't spend on anything else. So how do we actually start to fix this? And this is the issue. We don't, in opposition, we don't have a whole department, which is called Treasury, to help us. And it's pretty obvious to me that the government, who do have Treasury to help them with the budget, are largely ignoring advice. Because we've seen advice from Treasury that says, you have to start fixing this, you have to intervene early, because the longer you leave it, the worse the action has to be to bring the budget under control. But what we've seen with this government is just continual spend, and not rein things in. So where can we start to rein things in? Well, I think one spot, which is probably the easiest place to start, is to stop the waste, to stop the absolute blowouts in projects, just like we've seen with the TT line. So the wharf project that they forgot to build a wharf for the new ships. Well, that project's gone from 90 million to well over $400 million. That is a lot of money that has to be paid for, and it will be paid for by the state. And we've seen TT lines so bad now that they're basically insolvent. The Auditor General has said that the TT line is currently insolvent. There's a bit of argument about that, but the reality is that the state's going to have to bail out TT line again and again and again, and that is going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. So we've got a situation where the government completely stuffs something up, like they forget to build a wharf, and that results in a massive amount of money that needs to be basically put into TT line to keep them afloat. So if you've got a government who's actually competent when it comes to big projects like the TT line, then you will absolutely save money. And that will make the budget better. Absolutely, that's an easier place to start. But it's not just TT line where there's a problem. So we've just heard a couple of weeks ago that Metro, so the bus service, the state-owned bus service in Tasmania, had a ticketing project. So they wanted to go to ticketing so you could use the same system on every bus, and that was going to cost, and the ferries as well, that was going to cost $7 million. And guess what? Now it apparently is going to cost $65 $5 million, which is almost 10 times more. So how can this happen? So I think one of the easiest places for the state to save money is to stop wasting it by these constant blowouts on every project. So if the state and the Liberals actually get better at managing big projects, then the budget will start to come under control. But look, that is the easiest place to start. Another issue that gets raised is obviously raising taxes. So this is the spend. You can spend less or you can earn more. So, and obviously raising taxes is a pretty big issue. And as soon as anybody mentions raising taxes, then the headlines write themselves. The issue for us in opposition is we really don't have Treasury to help us to go through options. Obviously, if you raise any particular tax or charge, it has an impact. Who does it impact? Is it fair? How much income is it going to bring in? How is it going to hurt the economy and so on? You really need to have a whole department helping you. But what we've seen over the past 5, 6 or longer years is the state government's actually been giving away revenue by reducing taxes or reducing stamp duty and so on. Now, some of that's actually been a good idea to try and stimulate the economy, but also it has cut our revenue coming into the state. So much so that basically if you look across all the states, then Tasmania has the lowest rate of our what they call own source revenue than any other state. So our budget situation means that we basically get 2/3 of our budget come from the federal government in one form or another. The biggest form is GST, but then there's also other money that comes in for various things like to top up health funding, to top up education funding, and to fund infrastructure spends on bridges and highways. So, but when you compare us to other states, we are absolutely far more heavily reliant on the federal government than any other state. So that obviously you can't change. And no wonder the federal government says stuff like Tasmania is a mendicant state, or basically the pauper, constantly with our hand out for top-ups. So that what do we do about our own source revenue? Now, to be brutally honest, I'm not really in a position to come up with options today, but that is something that any government actually needs to work on. And you'd think with a state government with the Treasury, a whole department to help them, may come up with a few options. And obviously people need to see those options and agree. Nobody wants to pay more tax. That's absolutely right. But at the moment, we are so low with our own source revenue compared to other states. We have to do something about it. Now look, it might not actually be all about tax. It may be trying to get more revenue by getting more mines going, for example, to bring in more money from royalties. There are options that we can try and push, but I think that we actually need a bit of a discussion about own source revenue, and maybe that's a topic for another day. The other thing you can obviously do is slash spending, cuts. And it looks like that's maybe where the government is lining up. So the government's talking about, the Liberals are talking about cutting 2,800 state servants. So that is actually a very decent cut. But the way that they're going to do that is simply by what they call vacancy control. So anybody who resigns, that position doesn't get filled, and it's actually a very, very poor way to do things. But then I suppose if you do it that way, you don't have to pay for redundancies and the like. But what it means is that areas where you actually need new people, you can't get them because of these hiring freezes. So in fact, it's inefficient. But I mean, the government have been talking about reducing the state service, but they haven't. In fact, the state service has completely gone the other way. But when it comes to spending, one of the issues that we've got in Tasmania is that the economy has been largely propped up by state spending. So if you suddenly haul in state spending, that's on infrastructure, that's on wages, that's on all sorts of things. We're very heavily, as a state, reliant on state government spending. If that gets pulled back all of a sudden, it could actually cause a massive economic shock. And that's why when we talk about repairing the budget, it has to be done over a long period of time, because if you do it in a rush, then what's going to happen is everybody's going to feel it. And I think in Tasmania that has a big effect suddenly we'll see people or more people wanting to leave, house prices dropping, business confidence getting trashed and so on. So you've got to be very careful about how we do this. But we have to be realistic as well. When it comes to the state service, employees, basically employee expenses make up pretty much almost half of the state's $9 billion budget. So if you look at employee expenses, so next year it's going to be 4.3 billion of a $10 billion budget. So it's roughly half. So if we are going to reduce spending, then we obviously got to talk about the state service. But the issue that we've got here in Tasmania, though, is that we've got a state service that's growing, right? So this is one of the things the government have put in place vacancy control over a number of years, and that state service is growing. You've only got to look in the budget at table 3.12, which is the government sector FTEs per capita, and what we've seen is it's going from 5,300 in 2022 to 5,800 this year. Right, and that's a per capita figure. So that means if you work it out, I think roughly there's been about 1,600 more state service employees employed over the last couple of years. So how does this actually work though? So we've got this big growth in the number of employees, and yet we see services aren't improving. And we see staff that are stressed. Now, there are some ways to explain this. So we've got vacancy control, right? So we're supposed to be reducing the number of state servants by vacancy control, but it's a terrible way to do things, but that's what the government have said that they've been doing. And yet the number of state servants has increased over the last couple of years by about 800 or so every year. But what's happening here? Now, one way of explaining it could be, and we've just heard from the police commissioner who said when an officer's on stress leave, then the police force can't actually replace that officer for at least 12 months. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, because there's actually at the moment there's 102 police officers that are on stress leave. 102 police officers on stress leave. Now, I've said in some of my social medias, I've pointed out that there's been a huge increase in stress leave across the public service, so much so that it's costing the budget like another $118 million on insurance for stress leave. It's just an incredible thing. So on one side, we've got the government saying that they are going to reduce the number of state servants. We've got the number of state servants actually growing, and we've got a huge number on stress leave, and the services aren't getting better. This is something that is a massive conundrum. How can this actually be? We've got more state servants, we've got more stress, and yet services are actually declining when you look at things like our school results, for example. We know that the teachers are very stressed. We don't have enough teachers for the classrooms. We don't have enough teacher assistants and so on. We see that the nurses, they're always under pressure too. We see that there's a whole range of stress all across. So we know that there's a whole heap of vacancies, for example, in pharmacists in hospital because they can't recruit. The government are always talking about, every now and then you'll see a press conference about the number of nurses that have been hired, or they've just put on 10 paramedics and so on. But what they never talk about is the net, because what we know is there's a number of people resigning as well. But this is it just really does my head in. How can this actually be that we're increasing the number of state servants and yet the services are declining? I think that's something that we absolutely need to come to grips with. But I have a theory, and I'll talk about that. And that is probably an area that we could look at to start turning the budget around. For this next bit, I thought I'd better get comfortable because it's going to be a little bit heavy hitting, maybe. So I've been down here in estimates, and I had the estimates for the output, which is small business, consumer affairs and trade. So in the scheme of things, this is actually a very small input. It's got hardly any line items in the budget. It's nothing like health. It's nothing like education. It's nothing like state growth, for example. It's actually a very small component of the budget. And yet in that estimate, I was amazed at the number of department officials and advisors that the minister had. And it really smacked me in the face that things are just out of control. So I've been in Parliament, since 2017. I've been to estimates every year. About 8 estimates. And it just really hit me hard that you had this very small part of the budget and yet we had a room full of people. And it sort of highlighted to me maybe where the problem is with the state service budget. I think that probably what's happened in the state service is that we've gone from a management that looked like a triangle, so with a secretary at the top, a couple of deputy secretaries, and as you get towards the bottom of the triangle, then you have the people at the coalface. It seems to me that what we've actually got in the state service now is more of a square. So you've got a state secretary, but then you've got heaps of deputy secretaries, and so much so that the government have even created another position called an associate secretary. So I think that what we're seeing across the state service is that it's the top of the state service, the management level, that is well and truly grown massively just by when you look at the number of people that are showing up to something like estimates. I'd really love to see an organisational chart of some of these departments, because I think the growth absolutely must have been in that upper management level, because we're not seeing it down at the grassroots, at the level of the nurse, of the cleaner, of the teacher, of the teacher's assistant, of the policeman, of the fireman. We're not seeing it there. So where is it? My only explanation is that the growth must be in the upper part of the state service. Now, what we see is also that the state servants at the top are also receiving very, very large paychecks. It was only last week that we saw that the Secretary of the Health Department is on something like $700,000 a year, and one of his deputy secretaries is actually on more than him, on $730,000 or $40,000 a year. That is a lot of money. So from one of those positions, you can obviously employ something like 7 nurses or the like. So what I suspect in the state service is that we've seen a big growth in the upper management. Now, what do we do about that? Well, I think what happens to any government over time is that if the bureaucracy is not managed, then the bureaucracy will grow. Now, let's talk about Shane Broad's theory on bureaucracy. I suppose some of you who know me know how much I love an apple, right? Love an apple. I think sometimes you could compare a bureaucracy to an apple tree. So if you've got an apple tree and you leave it to itself, what it does, it grows and grows and grows. It grows extra branches, it grows on top of itself, and what actually happens in the end is that the apple tree stops producing as much apples. So what do you do? Well, if you're in the orchard, then you need to actually reshape the tree so that it can grow more apples actually on less of a tree. So what you do is that you go for a nice vase shape, which is the way that I like to prune my apple trees. So the first thing you need to do is limit the number of branches, trim things back, and you actually end up with more fruit. Now, I think what's actually happened in the bureaucracy is that the bureaucracy has grown. The Liberals have basically just let it grow and grow and grow, and it's actually become inefficient. But it's not at the bottom that we're seeing the inefficiencies. I think it's at the upper management levels. So what we probably need to do is actually restructure the public service. And we see, you just look at the way that the public service in Tasmania is structured, and you can just see how there are built-in inefficiencies. And you've got to look no further than state growth. You've got a state growth department that is absolutely enormous. You've got one secretary, but you've got 8 ministers or something like 8 ministers. Now, how is that a good management structure? I think we need to have a good look at the public service and actually say, well, what is actually a better way to manage it, rather than have one secretary, huge department, lots of managers required, and lots of ministers. You imagine if you are the secretary for state growth and you've got 8 ministers, if you met with those 8 ministers for an hour a week, which probably isn't a big demand, there's a whole day gone just in meeting your ministers. So it's just very inefficient. And then the other thing that happens with a big department like that is if something goes wrong, who's to blame? Is it that minister? Is it that minister? So the accountability's all wrong. Whereas I think if you had a better structure, it would be like the pyramid. You've got a minister, you've got a secretary, and then you've got one department. Now that would actually require a bit of change, but I think that's something that we, as a state, maybe we need to think about. These mega departments maybe aren't actually working as well as they could. But I think the main thing that we need to do when we talk about the state service is it's not necessarily about sacking people either. It's not necessarily about reducing the headcount. What we really need is to get more for the same spend. So for example, we don't need to sack a whole bunch of nurses, but wouldn't it be great if we had a system where we could get more people through the hospital for the same spend? We have the most expensive per patient health system in the country. I mean, we can improve. Why aren't we improving? These are the questions. So the management structure that we've got is actually not delivering. What we need to do is get more people through the hospital, and what we see is a lack of control, I think, of spending and where the money's allocated, and a bureaucratic structure that is inefficient. So for example, from what I've heard, if a department wants to employ a nurse, it actually takes a very long time to get through the system. It probably got to go through 4 or 5 hands to get approved to employ a nurse for a period of time, to make a nurse permanent, for example. It takes a long, long time. It's got to go through HR, it's got to go through all these steps to get approved. It's got to justify the need for an extra nurse, and so on and so on. Because there is a risk that maybe if a department is overstaffed, that every now and then that particular nurse may not have a lot to do, right? That is the risk that they're trying to avoid. But what is happening in reality is that the nurses that we've got are massively overworked, and if somebody's sick or the ED's flooded with people, which happens more and more often, you pick up the phone and you get an agency nurse, and that happens like that. And they're doing that so constantly, and those agency nurses cost a hell of a lot of money. You'd be far better off actually taking a risk and employing that nurse, and maybe the off chance that the ward is overstaffed every now and then, instead of relying on agency nurses, which cost a hell of a lot of money. And the same can be said for locum doctors. So the risk of employing a specialist or a doctor, and then maybe every now and then not having enough to do, instead of risking that, they'll spend a fortune on locums. And what I suspect as well is that when you look at the budget, that the nurse, a full-time nurse comes from one bucket of money, and then you've got this other bucket of money for agency nurses that, and it's easy to get money out of the agency nurse bucket, and it's very hard to actually expand the full-time nurse bucket. So these are the sorts of inefficiencies that are built in, and I imagine that there's a whole management structure built around this that is also inefficient. So I think if we're going to think about the public service, we need to actually think about not sacking a whole bunch of people, but actually having a better management process where we can get more done for the same spend, or at least not see the massive growth that we've seen in spending. So in the health budget, we've seen an increase year on year at about 10 or 12%. It's becoming such a huge budget item that we just can't go on. If we could put in a management structure and a way of managing our hospitals that meant that we could just keep the growth in health spending down to 4 or 5%, that would make a huge difference to the budget over the long term. But again, from opposition, it's very difficult to actually make changes or give exact examples of how that management structure should be changed, because we don't have a whole department to help us. We can obviously talk with our unions, and our unions, they absolutely give us feedback. And I think that the unions and the workers are actually the ones who could help guide us through this whole process, especially if we made a compact with the state service that said, look, if you can save money, however you can save money, we're not actually going to take that off you. We're going to allow you to reinvest that back into your own departments and make things even better over time. But look, you know, maybe I'll cop some flack for making the suggestion, but what it looks like to me is that the state service has become top heavy, and the workers at the bottom are the ones who are really copping it. They're really stressed, whether it be a police officer, whether it be a teacher, whether it be a nurse, and across all other departments. But this upper management level appears to me to have gotten well out of control, and probably that's where we need to pay some attention, because you know, if we're going to turn this budget thing around, wages make up half the budget. So we can't continually have this upper management section of the state service grow and grow and grow. We have to have a better management structure, and hopefully that can turn things around. So getting back to the Apple analogy, what happens typically when there's a change of government is that the new government can come in and it can actually make changes. It can bring in new thoughts, new people, and make change. And that's why we see when a new government comes in, we can actually get better results out of the money spent. And I would argue, obviously, from opposition, that it's about time that we had a change of government so that we actually could go in and try and improve the outcomes of the state services, because what we're seeing at the moment just isn't good enough. Stressed workforce, it's costing us more, and we're getting worse results. This has to change. So anyway, I'll throw that one out there and see what anybody thinks. But you know, when it comes to fixing the budget, I think there are some places that we can look. As I've said, we can talk about reducing the waste. We can get the structure of our management better. We can restructure the public service to get better outcomes. And I think the place we should start is right at the top. Thanks for listening to the broadcast. If you like this sort of content, remember to like and subscribe and share all over the place. And till next time, bye for now.